Hello, this is my presentation that I gave at the PGIS conference in San Luis Obispo in 2017 on adults, children, and seniors using maps in mixed group discussions for urban planning. So in this presentation, I'm going to describe our study that we did about mixed group discussions for urban planning. Then I will outline our findings, and I'll provide some recommendations for organizers using mixed group discussions. So the study we're doing is called an experimental simulation, which is commonly used in human-centered design, data visualization, and human-computer interaction. So it can lead to a lot of information while reducing costs of more realism. And it's basically where you create a lab-style experiment, but it's not entirely restricted to experimental methods. Usually the results are qualitative, they're used to identify problems and future research areas. So for our study design, I basically took focused groups, and these are of mixed ages, and I provided them with some human location data. And I put them in essentially an urban planning scenario, and then I just watched. I did this 4 times, and I asked, what do I learn about mixed group discussions for urban planning? So why are we interested in mixed groups, which are basically, as I'm doing it, children and adults together? Well, we have seen, or we know, that participatory methods are aimed at including perspectives from marginalized groups. And one marginalized group is children. So we know that children are often left out of planning decisions that affect them. There are not a lot of studies that involve children, and the studies that I have read about and seen are usually done in schools where children are interviewed among their peers. But children may attend community meetings with their parents, hence we have mixed groups. So why are we interested in using location data? Well, there is a deluge of data currently there due to GPS tracking devices and smartphones, and various disciplines have approached and used this data for the benefit of society, such as citizen science, crowdsourcing, PPGIS, and PGIS. But we're curious if public involvement in analyzing data leads to new understandings. So what about focus groups? Well, they're commonly used as an engagement process by municipalities in urban planning. They're good for understanding the scope of a problem, and researchers are optimistic about focus groups bringing divergent views together. Some of the disadvantages of using focus groups are that results can't be generalized, and ideally it's only one part of a holistic engagement process. So our study questions are, what group characteristics do we observe? How is the data being used? And what are some opportunities and challenges we observe related to mixed groups? So we're talking, and we used for our scenario, a new water play area in downtown Calgary. And we used a tabletop interactive surface with superimposed graphics on a digital map. There were sliders on and off and transparency of the layers, and zoom using gestures. They were also provided with photographs of the site and a map to show where the photographs were taken, although all participants except one had been to the park. So for our participants, we had 4 groups. One group had 1 senior, 2 adults. Group 2 had 2 children, 2 adults. Group 3 had 1 child, 2 adults. And Group 4 had 1 child and 2 adults. So the groups with children had a mix of a parent and a community member. So for our design scenario, we were really interested, we thought a lot about this, and we wanted really to create neutral questions that were equally engaging both to children and adults. And we chose not to use a real-world scenario because we felt that if there may be bias, if a person had previous experience or knowledge about a particular area and have a personal attachment to it. But we also wanted to create a sense of a mission that was larger than themselves. It was a whole an altruistic, larger mission, and that the people in the room, we wanted them to understand that they represented a larger population and that their decisions would affect many people. And we also wanted them to have fun. So our design scenario, we said that evil aliens from outer space have beamed you up to their spaceship. You must now represent your species. So we had them do 3 tasks that are actually pretty common in urban planning focus groups, such as identifying their values, prioritizing their values, and making a decision. But we framed this in the alien context. So we said, We aliens know nothing of your strange human ways. Tell us, why is this park so important to you? For prioritizing, we said the boss alien is very stupid. Which 5 of these ideas should we tell them? And to decide, we said we can only guarantee protection of 3 things when we destroy your planet. Which ones should we pick? So the feedback was that the alien forces, that the participants had fun. So our analysis is going to be in terms of group characteristics that we observed, how the groups used data, and particularly in terms of what made the difference when there were children involved. So for group characteristics, we observed 3 general characteristics. We had a conversational characteristic, accommodating, and individual. So group 1 we saw was conversational. They approached the questions in terms of why do humans behave the way they do. They shared a lot of personal stories, so we counted the number of statements and that coded statements related to certain themes or topics. The green bar is how many statements were basically sharing personal stories, and you can see that was what they did the most. The pink bar is how much they talked about the data, and when they did talk about the data a little bit, and when they did, it was basically around what does the data mean. Groups 2 and 3 were accommodating. So these groups were working towards helping the children and making the study related to the children. So they engaged in something we call simplifying and filtering. For example, from question 1, where they're supposed to be identifying values, they modified the question a little bit to recording activities. So where we asked why do humans like this park, they sort of changed the questions to what do you like to do in the park. They also did tell a lot of personal stories, and they did use the data, and they used the data to resolve challenges, which I will talk about more later. So group 4 was more individual. They decided that they wanted to brainstorm the most idea as possible. And this sort of created a little bit of time pressure and competition and a little bit of stress. They did come up with the most ideas of all the groups, of 44. So this purple bar is talking about the study mechanics. So they focused on how to approach the study. How should we categorize these topics? How should we answer this question? And as you see, they barely used the data at all. So with data usage, now we're going to talk about data usage, particularly when groups use the data, how did groups use the data, and when did people not use the data. So this is a general overview of our entire study. At the top we have the groups, and at the side we have the questions, 1 at the top, 2, and then 3. And you can see in green, this is when the data was used. So it was used most to decide by 3 groups, second to identify values by 2 groups, and once to prioritize. As you can see, group 4 did not use the data at all. So we looked at all these different times that people used the data and tried to understand how they were using it and why they were using it, and we coded these and grouped them. So overall, we saw that they were using the data for inspiration, to negotiate, and to choose. So, for example, using data for inspiration, one person said, so what is it about those 2 hotspots? It is a really inviting place for people to go in the water. It's where I'd imagine most of the kids are playing. So here you can see they start with some of the data, and then they start talking about what might be happening there and what it means. In terms of using the data to decide, one person might say, I think we are saying this path, right? Another person said, but you said that path floods. So we've got to negotiate 2 paths. We will give the aliens some of our benches for more of the path. So in this case, they are combining both the data and their personal experience to make an overall decision that combines both. When groups did not use the data was when they were having these meta discussions in terms of categorizing or discussing how to approach the problem. Also, if there's no disagreement, if someone put an idea forward and everyone instantly agreed, typically the data was not considered. Also, when sharing personal stories, as you can see, sometimes they did use it, but mostly just sharing their personal experiences, they didn't refer to the data. So in terms of mixed groups with children, we are going to talk about children's contributions, how children use the data to negotiate, and risks of including children with adults. So overall, we counted just the number of words spoken by each participant, and the pink is adults and the blue is children. As you can see, adults did speak more than children. And we saw that this was often because adults took on leadership roles and the statements were much more complex spoken by adults. I want to talk about this idea of using data to negotiate or to prove a point, because I think this is really interesting. So this is what happened in one group. The adult said, they're trying to select their top 5 ideas. So this is in prioritizing. And an adult said, we've got be happy, walk to and from work, watching the birds swim, and visit with friends. And then another adult said, the only one I don't know about is swim. And a child said, pointing at the map, look at all these people swimming. Another child said, yeah, look how many people were in the water. The adult said, oh, really? Oh, that's right. I didn't even notice that. So we think this is really interesting because the children actually did use the data to argue their point. Also, it's kind of cool that the adult agreed immediately after seeing the evidence. There was basically no argument. And this suggests that data could be useful for children getting their perspectives heard. Also, the adult hadn't previously noticed that the data showed people swimming until the children pointed it out. And we think this is interesting. So we think this could be due to something called inattentional blindness, which is a well-researched phenomenon where people don't actually see something unless it's pointed, if they don't expect it, or until it's pointed out. Which could be a problem in data analysis, and it's an argument for having children together with adults where they could educate each other, and it could result in radically different outcomes. So some of the risks in terms of including children are that children's ideas may have less weight when they're among adults, especially when there is stress. So this result may result in children's perspectives not being counted, even though they are present. So when a child may be asking to speak, and if we saw this especially in group 4 when they're kind of had this sense of stress. So with simplifying, another risk is simplifying and filtering. So sometimes if adults filter or simplify the questions for children, we saw this happen in, as I mentioned, in the group where they changed the question a little bit. Also, when using the data exclusively to decide, which happened in both 2 and 3, so the decision didn't take into account personal stories or preferences that they'd had before. It was basically in this way of simplifying the question. And it could result in children's and groups' insights not being counted. So for an example of this where they use the data exclusively to decide and don't include a more complex understanding and personal stories, where one child said, let's find the tree that the most people sit under. That's a good idea, and the bench that has the most people on it, and the path that has the most people on it. Do you agree? Yep. And that's basically their whole discussion to make a decision, despite the fact that they had just spent almost 45 minutes discussing all their personal experiences in the park. So in summary, we have group characteristics, how people use the data, and mixed groups. Overall, in conclusion, we observed multiple conditions in mixed group discussions that organizers should account for when planning future studies. Particularly, we think it's interesting that mixed groups can allow for education between demographics, and data can be used by children to support their contribution. But also, organizers should not assume that all perspectives are counted when including children in group discussions due to simplifying, filtering, and ignoring. Our recommendations are that organizers consider structuring the format of the session to accommodate mixed groups, perhaps by including training for adults, working with demographics separately and then together, allowing time for complex discussion, structuring both simple and complex questions, providing data so that all demographics can use it, and consider using mixed groups to encourage education. And that is the end of my study. Thank you.